All right, so we'll get started right now. Again, a good evening to all of y'all. My name is Aditya. Uh, some of y'all would have seen me at the Koramangala Center taking the quant sessions. Some of y'all would have heard me if you had taken the access to the quant course that we have. Some of y'all would have also seen me maybe in Mumbai or Delhi when Arun and me came down for some sessions. So what we're going to do today, right, before we start, I'm going to put in some ground rules of how we're going to proceed with the webinar so that you are clear and I'm also clear on what the requirements are, right? At any point, right, that you feel that there's a lag in terms of voice, there's a lag in terms of me moving from one slide to another, quickly, please let me know in the chat window. If not, there should be a problem from your end. So quickly log out and log in. Okay. It's going to be a 90-minute webinar. I may extend it to 2 hours. I may take questions towards the end. So how I've divided these, approximately 2 hours that we have is I'm going to speak about all timing strategies for the first, say, 1.5 hours. Okay. I'm going to speak about all timing strategies for quant. Since I'm a quant faculty, I would bring in examples of how you can apply those timing strategies on questions. For verbal, I'm going to give you timing strategies for RC, SC, and CR, right? But the first bit of the entire webinar will speak about an overall timing aspect of what you can expect on the GMAT, right? At the end of my entire webinar, right, I'm going to keep around 20 minutes of a discussion or Q&A session. So any sort of questions you have, right, you want to ask me in terms of prep, in terms of what we discussed in the webinar, just hold on to the last part of the webinar, right? I'm going to give you all 20 minutes and I'll try to cater to all questions that are in the chat window. Another point, guys, please post in your queries in the chat window itself rather than separately in the Q&A section. It becomes easier for me to juggle between writing on the PPT as well as typing out your answers in the chat window. The Q&A would be also not visible by all the other students, right? So just make sure that any question you have is put in the chat window. All right. Okay, so let's start. So before we start, I have one question. What are y'all expecting out of this webinar? Okay, so that I'm clear about your expectations and I can deliver based on that. So quickly in the chat window, if you can type in what you expect to gain from this webinar, I can tweak my entire lecture to match with what requirements are. Yes, Nitin, the recording will be available later. All webinars that we take, the recording will be available later. So guys, quickly type in what are you expecting from this webinar. Strategy to ace the GMAT, okay? Not randomly guess last few questions for lack of time, reasoning skills, all possible time strategies for verbal, good techniques, how to set milestones. Okay. RC strategy, all right. Hard to know, it's time to mark and move on. Okay, approaching questions quickly, time management, does guessing impact scores, fearless attitude. Okay, when to move on from a complex question, time management breakups for each, 700 plus go, how to become a faculty at Crack Verbal. Okay, all right, perfect. So I got a pretty good sense of what is required, and maybe my webinar will take care of all aspects of things. Some people have touched upon the entire algorithm aspect of the GMAT, right, where timing strategy is going to impact your score. Some people have said RC becomes an issue, right, because that's the clear red herring, that creates a problem with your entire time. We'll deal with RC slightly. We'll look at also at what points and at when guessing strategies will make better sense. And we'll also look at, right, especially for quant, why exactly students spend too much time on questions, right? We look at how you can actually get to an answer. Every question, trust me, even the hardest ones, right? Every question can be solved in exactly 2 minutes, sometimes under 2 minutes, right? Within a minute. It's just that the approach that you use is not, the exact approach, the shortest approach to get to an answer. Okay. After how much time is it apt to skip a question? I will deal with all of that. And I will deal with all of these questions, right, with specific data. So I'm coming to the first part of my slide, right? And obviously, all of you all are aware of the fact that the new format of the GMAT has 31 questions in quant and 36 questions on verbal, right? And for the 31 questions on quant, you have 62 minutes to solve, and 36 questions you're going to have 65 minutes to solve. So I try to pre-assume what questions normally you would have. So obviously the question which was prevalent, right, in the entire chat window is how can I accurately time myself to spend exactly those many seconds per question. Now the first thing that I want to address is many people think that looking at the time and the number of questions that you need to spend exactly 120 seconds on a quant question and exactly 109 seconds on a verbal question. That's not exactly the case, right? When we say you're going to spend 120 seconds on a question, basically this means on average, right? So if you have a quant question and on one quant question, you've ended up spending 3 minutes, and on another quant question, you've got the answer very quickly in a minute, your still overall time averages to 2 minutes, isn't it? So the first myth that I want to break here is for you to, be under the assumption that you are forced to solve a question in exactly 2 minutes or under 2 minutes. Okay. Trust me, on the harder quant questions, you will need to spend that extra 30 seconds, extra 40 seconds just to get to an answer, because the questions are going to be complicated in the sense they're going to mix topics, right? And sometimes they would make calculations also not very easy. So in those types of questions, right, it's imperative that you spend 3 minutes. But you can do it if you've spent 1 minute on another question, right? Because by spending a minute on one question, you've saved a minute that you can put into the question that you spent 3 minutes on. So one thing, keep in mind that when we speak about 120 seconds and 109 seconds, it's on an average, right? All of y'all. So don't be under the assumption that you need to spend exactly 1 minute, right? 48 seconds on every verbal question, right? This is exactly not what we want you to do. The best way to distribute your time, right? Or the best way to get to the average of 1 minute 48 seconds is ideally the ideal time required to solve any sentence correction question is 1 minute 15 seconds. The ideal time required to solve any reading comprehension question is 2 minutes 3 seconds. And finally, the ideal time, right, that you require to solve any CR question is again around 2 minutes 10 seconds, right? I don't want all of you all to be under the assumption that you need to spend 2 minutes on every question, right? It's segregated based on different topics. Ideally, SC questions are your time savers, right? Same as data sufficiency question. Data sufficiency questions on quant are time savers. Some of you all may balk at what I say, but trust me, data sufficiency questions are easier to solve than problem solving questions because you don't need to get to an answer. You need to check if you can get to an answer, right? And obviously the bigger problem I would say on the verbal section, right, is the time that you're going to spend on a CR question is ideally going to be a lot more than the time you're going to spend on one single RC question, right? Obviously RC, you'll have to read the passage, and that we'll look at it as a separate section of what you need to do on RC, how you need to split your time between reading a passage and the questions. But when it comes to a CR question, right, the reason why we recommend that you use a good part of 2 minutes or slightly more than 2 minutes to break down the entire question is, one, because you have to read the entire stimulus carefully. On top of that, you have to go through each and every answer choice, right? Reading the answer choice one by one and figuring out what stays within the purview of the argument and what would be a typical assumption on that question, right? So you're forced to read everything in a CR question, right? And you have to read things very carefully, because on harder levels of questions, they play around with, introducing 1 or 2 words, which changes the entire, validity of an entire question statement, right? So just make sure that when you work with a CR question, you give yourself that time of 2 minutes 10 seconds. And if it's an SC question, the reason why you're going to spend only 1 minute and 15 seconds on it is because, one, when you look at an SC questions, right, your answer choices are always going to be designed in a way that you're going to have some 3-2 splits, right? You're going to have A, B, and C answer choices which start with the word is, and you're going to have D and E answer choices which are going to start with the word are, right? So once you figure out that you have something like is and are, that the question is going to deal with subject verb agreement, you can actually eliminate 2 or 3 of the answer choices, right? So sentence correction questions are the ones which are very, very easy because you're not required to read the entire, right, answer choice for you to make an elimination. Right, now coming to the $1,000,000 question, right, that all of you all had is, what do I do for a reading comprehension passage? Right, ideally the time that needs to be spent on a reading comprehension passage is 7 to 8 minutes, right? 3 to 4 minutes to get a complete gist of the passage, right? I would say 3 minutes ideally, 4 minutes would be, pushing it slightly, and the remaining 3 to 4 minutes where you answer the 3 or 4 questions that follow, right? Now, what happens in RC, right? What happens in RC? Obviously, the time that you would take to read an RC is key because one, you'll need to read at a speed which is comfortable for you, and second, you'll need to read in such a way that you at least get a gist of all the paragraphs that you're working with, right? If you don't understand, the entire passage, then you're in big trouble. So we'll look at the guessing strategy for that towards the end. But you spend a good part of 3 to 4 minutes skimming, right? Skimming the entire passage. Don't get into details, right? And get boggled with the details that the RC passage provides. Make sure you skim and hold on to definite pieces of information, right? Critical pieces of information. Something like, the points that I would hold on to are points where the author is giving his opinion, right? Suddenly I see the word therefore or however, right? Because it basically gives me a transition point where the idea is completely shifting in the opposite direction. So I would make a note of those part of the passages for me to figure out what needs to be done later, right? So it's 3 to 4 minutes for you to get the gist of the passage and 3 to 4 minutes to answer the 3 or 4 questions that follow. Now, the best thing to do and the time savers that you have, right, on the RC questions are the main purpose questions. And the second are the anchor phrase questions. Okay. Now, the main purpose questions and the anchor phrase questions, right, are the ones that are referred to low hanging fruit because you can quickly get to an answer, in a minute or 45 seconds. Just pick an answer and move on. But the problematic area, right, in an RC passage is the one where you will have to pick data from a passage because you'll have to go to the exact point that that statement is mentioned, and you'll have to look at the paragraphs before that statement and the paragraphs after the statement to get to an answer. But the most problematic of all the RC questions is the inference based questions. And my advice, whenever you see an inference based questions, it's similar to a CR question, right? So for these questions, ideally you would spend around, say, 1.5 to 2 minutes. But for the main purpose and for the anchor phrase question, I would normally expect any student to spend a minute max because it's very easy to figure out the main purpose and figure out the anchor phrase there. Okay. So when it comes to an RC passage, my first instinct would be try to finish the passage in around 7 to 8 minutes. Now, how do you prepare for this, right? What happens when, how do you reduce your reading, how do you reduce your reading speed, right? How do you basically read things faster? And do you start, working with RC questions, putting that hard stop of 7 to 8 minutes? See, I'm gonna break this down into 3 phases of prep, okay? The first phase of prep, if students are in the first phase, right, you're starting off understanding the concepts, you've learned the concepts, you've just started working with the official guide, you've started working with reading comprehension questions. My advice to those kinds of students would be, do not put yourself under time pressure in the beginning itself, right? In your first phase of prep, once you're going through the concepts, your focus should always be on accuracy, right? Now, when I say focus should be on accuracy, that does not mean that you take like 20 minutes to solve an RC passage. But ideally, even if you take 10 minutes, right, or 11 minutes to solve the entire RC passage, despite you having to solve it in 7 to 8 minutes, that's absolutely fine. As long as you get a sense of that passage, as long as you answer the questions and you get the majority of the questions right. So for people in your first phase of prep, please, it's not recommended that you go and put yourself in that time pressure in the beginning itself. So what I recommend to all my students, right, and at the Koramangala Center, the classroom sessions, I always tell the students that when you're working with the questions from the official guide, right, and remember this, the questions from the official guide, the homework will be mapped to your classroom program or your online program, right? When you work with the questions from the OG, always work with the questions for accuracy. And this holds good for all sections, okay? For quant, for verbal, and even for, SC, RC, and CR as well, right? Verbal, all three sections. And when you're working with the OG, right, and you're concentrating on accuracy, make sure you review all the questions that you solve, okay? And the best way to review the questions is not to look up the explanations in the OG itself. The best way to review questions is to look up the explanations on forums like GMAT Club, right? Beat the GMAT, our own Crack Verbal forum. Look up explanations there and look up explanations to questions of not only the ones that you got wrong, but also the ones that you answered correctly, right? Prioritize the ones you've got wrong, but also look up the explanations, the ones you've answered right. Because what happens, right, when you analyze the questions that you've answered right, um, when you look up the explanations, you would see different modes of approach on how to get to an answer. For example, in an SC questions, right, in an SC question, you would have eliminated an answer choice based on an idiom, but you would have overlooked that there is also a parallelism issue on that statement, right? So you can go back and make a note of that extra error that you have, right? And why, and also write down why you didn't identify the parallelism issue. Same way on a quant question, right? You got to an answer, right? It took you like 2 minutes, but maybe, right, there would have been an easier approach. Instead of you introducing 2 to 3 variables to get to an answer, you could have actually used one variable and got to an answer way quicker. So all of these extra points that you take away from each question, right? Those are the kinds of points that you need to make a note of in your entire error log, right? So as you're working with the OG, do not put yourself under the time pressure, right? Only focus on accuracy. But once you finish the OG, and when you're working with the verbal review and the quant review, this is when you have to bring in time, okay? And the best way to work out questions from the verbal review and the quant review, right, is to always pick 31 questions from quant, 17 questions from problem solving, 14 questions from data sufficiency, and pick 36 questions from the verbal review, right? 10 questions from SC, 10 questions from CR, and 4 RC passages. And you see what I'm doing, right? I'm asking you to pick up questions to mimic the number of questions that you're going to get on the GMAT. And here I would ask you to work out 31 questions in 62 minutes and 36 questions in 65 minutes. So what are you doing now? You're putting yourself under the time pressure, right? And what happens when you put yourself under the time pressure? You will have to think faster. Things will have to strike your head a little faster, right? The concepts have to strike you faster. So there would be some aspects, right? Some concepts that you would be very, very comfortable with. There would be some concepts that you would not. So it gives you a clear identification of what concepts you'll have to work on. Okay. I know for a fact that for quant, right, many people spend a lot of time on number systems, right? Because they keep plugging in values, but they don't learn on how or what best values you can plug in. People lose a lot of time on inequalities, absolute values, and permutations, combinations of probability. Those are like hated topics on the quant front, right? And same with reading comprehension, right? Normally people are good at SC and CR, but suddenly an RC passage comes up, and say the RC passage deals with like an abstract topic of philosophy, right? And you end up reading like 3-4 paragraphs which are really dry and boring, and that takes you like 10 to 11 minutes, and your entire timing strategy is thrown out of the window, right? So you need to be prepared for all of these scenarios, right? And the best way to prepare for that is once you're working with the quant review and the verbal review, you always work it out in the timed practice set. Got it? And you continue with this kind of process with whatever questions you're working, even post the quant review and the verbal review, right? We provide you something called the question bank. So even in the question bank, when you're solving questions here, please make sure you make sets of 31 questions and 36 questions and then solve it in the time frame of 62 and 65 minutes respectively. All right. Okay, so that's the first bit of what I wanted to say. I'm going to give you all 5 minutes to ask me questions on what I've discussed so far, right? Maybe the other questions I will cater to towards the end. So any questions that you'll have based on what I've told you in the beginning here on how to manage your time and how to phase out your prep, I'll go into details with quant and verbal a little later. Guys, any specific questions that you want to ask me at this point? Sanjana, I told you, right? When you work with the OG should be worked, maybe 20 questions a day, 10 questions a day, 30 questions a day, but you should work with the OG not in a timed manner, but in terms of accuracy, right? So when you work with the OG, don't select the 31 questions, right? Work with the quant review and the verbal review, select 31 and 36 questions respectively. Okay, how to keep the momentum in the quant section? I'll touch upon that a little later. RC is lengthy, so is it right to spend only 1 minute 48 seconds? Bhavesh, I didn't say that RC you spend 1 minute 48 seconds. You spend around 2 minutes 3 seconds, right, on an average, and this is a typical pattern, right, that I've seen from a lot of ESRs. I mean, for people who don't know what an ESR is, an ESR is a report, a score report that a student who's taken the GMAT, right, would get. Right, he would apply for it separately. He would get the score report. So for people who have scored, 700 and above, the typical timing splits, right, for SC, CR, and RC would be CR would take the most time. Ideally 2 minutes 10 seconds. RC would take around 2 minutes 3 seconds, and you would have SC, which takes around a minute 45. Okay. So RC is lengthy, right? But the lengthy aspect of the RC is because you're going to read things a little more in depth, right? So you'll have to know how to skim and scan the passage and make sure you're done with the passage with like 3 minutes, right? In 3 minutes of time. Nauman, like I said, right, you don't need to worry about varying difficulty when you're working in the first phase of prep. Your first phase of prep, you should concentrate on, accuracies, right? And accuracies does not mean working with harder levels of questions. Now, and it's good you mentioned this, but one big problem, right, that I find students doing is when they see quant questions in the OG, they find that the first few quant questions are very, very easy. They start skipping the middle section and they go towards the end because the questions towards the end in the OG normally are harder. That's the worst strategy that you can utilize, okay? Because many students, right, think that I need to work on harder quant questions, but the fact of the matter is the only time in your entire test you're going to see harder levels of questions is only if you've got the easy and the medium levels of questions right. So if somebody has got like a 44, right, on quant in the practice tests, it does not mean that you've got the harder levels of questions wrong. A person who gets a 44 on a practice test means that you've not even seen the harder levels of questions, right? Because of how the test is designed, right? You have the test being computer adaptive. So the problem is not with the harder questions. The problem is with the easy and the medium questions going right. So the reason why the OG is very, very important, both on the quant and the verbal front, is it gives you those questions which are easy, medium, and medium hard, right? So if you have around 85 to 90% accuracy on those questions, then you're going to find the harder levels of questions. So my advice, don't worry about difficulty levels and do not worry about time when you work with the OG. Your focus should entirely be, I need to get a hang of this concept. I need to, worry about getting a right answer rather than about the time. Okay. All right. Okay. So let's go on to the next phase. Here's the next phase. Yeah. So before I go into this phase, right, there's some points that I want you to consider. Okay, the first point that I want you to consider, and maybe I would expect this question sometime later, is the fallacy of the first 10 questions. Now, many students, right, are under the assumption that the first 10 questions are the most important of your entire test, right? If you don't get the first 10 questions right, you're not going to score more than a 49 on quant, or you're not going to score more than a 35, 36 on verbal, right? That's completely, that's the biggest fallacy, I would say, right? Because your entire score is not based on your first 10 questions. Your entire score is based on your accuracies throughout the entire 31 questions on quant and throughout the entire 36 questions on verbal, right? Why the first 10 questions become important? Okay, I'm not saying that they're not important at all. I'm saying there's too much of emphasis that students put in the first 10 questions. The reason why the first 10 questions are important is because it sets the tone, right, of what kinds of questions you get later. But the big assumption here, right, is I'm sure most of you all would assume, since it's a computer adaptive test, that the first question that any test taker would see on the GMAT, your very first question, would be somewhere in the range of 500 or 540, right? Somewhere in the average ranges. But that's not the case. For test taker 1, the first question itself will be at a 540 level. But for test taker 2, the first question itself might be a 700 level, right? Never be under the assumption that the computer adaptiveness is going to be a linear increase or a linear decrease. The first question is going to start at any random level, because the algorithm does not know the test taker that is sitting in front of the computer, right? So what it's going to do in the first 10 questions, it's going to throw out slightly randomized difficulty levels of questions, right? So if the first test taker gets a 540, he gets this question right, then the next question will be slightly harder, something like a 580. The second test taker, the first question was 700. Say he gets this wrong, so the next question would be of a 660 range. But say in the second question, he gets right, so it's going to go to like a 670. Say he gets this wrong, it would drop to say a 650. So you see what happens, right? For every test taker, the test would start at a certain point, and then based on how you've answered the previous questions, the next questions would pop up. The difficulty levels would, adapt themselves to the answers to the previous question. So don't be under the assumption, right, that for everyone, the test would start at the approximate same level. The point I'm making here is, if you see your first question on quant or verbal, and you spend like 2.5 minutes, right, and you're not getting anywhere, you're like scratching your head, you're getting frustrated on what do I do from here, keep in mind that that question may have been, maybe a 650 or a 700 or 710 question that they started off with. So it's absolutely fine at that point to let go and continue with your test, and don't let the fact that the first 10 questions are key to hamper your entire test. Many students have come back to us and told us that, I got stuck up upon the first question, I spent 7 minutes on that and I couldn't recover. After that, I ended up with a 47 on quant. Right now, the reason why you're going to do that is because you have that drilled in your head, right? You've read so many things, so many times, people saying that the first 10 questions are key. But trust me, GMAT themselves say this, that the accuracy across the entire 31 questions and 36 questions is what is going to give you your entire score. So don't put too much of emphasis on the first 10 questions. My advice, if you have a good 80 to 90% accuracy, even if you have 1 or 2 errors, right, on your first 10 questions, that's absolutely fine, right? Your next set of questions will adapt themselves to your performance on the first 10, which has been pretty good, right? The second point that I want you to consider is the perception of time as we progress. Now, normally what happens, you see a question, right? The bigger problem that students have is, I don't want to let go, right? Especially on quant, no? I can solve this. I'm good at quant, right? You have that ego which pops in and says, I'm going to solve this question. And then you end up spending 4 minutes on a question and you say, okay, I can make this 2 minutes, I'm in 2 minutes deficit. I can make up this 2 minutes on another question. Trust me, if you go behind time and you say that, okay, I want to answer all of the questions and I can catch up on time later, that's never going to happen. Never, right? You're going to go in deficit of 2 minutes. You find another question, you're going to go another deficit of a minute, and things are just going to compound further, and it's going to be like a domino effect, right? You're going to, it's just going to be one card falling and everything falling apart after that. So never go with the perception, right, that I'm going to spend more than the time necessary because I can make up for that time later, right? Never say that, you never assume that you can make up for the time later, because you're assuming that the types of questions you will get later are questions you can manage, right? So be a little careful there. The third point I want you to keep in mind is this: the correlation between time spent and accuracy. I'm going to expand on this slightly, okay? And I want all of you all, to make a note of this, because this is going to be different for different test takers. Now, whenever you solve questions from the OG, right? When you solve questions from the OG, and when you start solving questions from the quant review and the verbal review, the first thing you're going to do, obviously, is you're going to maintain an error log, isn't it? What I'll do at the end of the session is I'm going to give you an error log, which is mapped to the latest OG of 2020 for both quant and verbal, that you can make use of, right? But what you're going to do in your error log basically is this: you're going to write down the accuracy, right, on the question type that you got, and you're going to also note down the time spent on that question, right? Now, ideally, for an ideal test taker, the time spent, I told you, on an SC question should be 1 minute 15 seconds. But you realize, okay, I get caught up upon SC. I realize that my accuracy is around 90% when I spend 1 minute 30 seconds, right? 90% accuracy. But when I try to rush through things, right, and I want to solve the questions with 1 minute 15 seconds, my accuracy drops to 75%. So for you, right, this becomes your ideal time spent on an SC question, right? So what's going to happen on test day? When you see an SC question, the ideal time spent, is going to be 1 minute 30 seconds. If you see that the solving of the question crosses 1 minute 30 seconds or goes into 1 minute 45-second regions, you know that it's not an ideal scenario for you. You're struggling with this question. That's a clear indicator of a question that you need to let go. Correct? And another scenario that students are going to find, on the test day is this, right? What happens is, see, when you sit on test day, right, there's going to be a lot of nerves. So when you start off a question on verbal, you're more careful, right? There's a big knot in your stomach. You want to settle down, right? Your palms are sweaty. So you take maybe 3 minutes. Then the second question also you take 3 minutes. Now you've calmed down slowly. But then as you go further, you realize that you have, say, 8 questions and you have only 10 minutes to solve, right? You have 8 questions, but you only have 10 minutes. Now, what would you think would be the ideal strategy to apply here if I have 8 questions and 10 minutes? Anybody can give me like what would they do if they have an 8-minute, 10 question scenario? Guys, what would you ideally do? Guess few and rush, alternate, slow 5, skip 3, random guess a few initial ones and complete it, solve 2 and guess 6. Now see, okay, most of y'all are telling me you're going to guess 6, you're going to solve 2, try to get 5 to 6 question right and get the rest. See, this is what you would do. Right? You have 8 questions, you have 10 minutes. What will be the worst strategy to do is to spend, say, 2 minutes on the first 5 questions, right? And then guess on the remaining 3, right? So you have another 3 questions and you have, say, 30 seconds left. You guess on the 3 questions, right? This is one approach that you can follow. Another approach you can follow is, I'm not going to worry about time. I have 10 minutes. So in those 10 minutes, I'm going to spend time. I have an RC that comes up. I'm going to skip an entire RC and I'm going to spend time on the last 4 questions. I'm going to dedicate this 10 minutes on the last 4 questions. Now, what you need to understand is this, okay? There are 2 things that are going to hamper your score. First, if you have too many mistakes on the lower levels of questions. Second, if you have continuous strings of errors. The GMAT is going to penalize you for continuous string of errors, and they're going to penalize you even more if you leave questions unanswered in the end. Okay, GMAT categorically tells this to us, that if you leave questions unanswered in the end, there's an error factor that is factored in your score, and you get slightly lesser than what you would have got if you had answered those questions wrong. Okay, you're going to be hampered if you have more than, so 2 to 3 continuous errors. So you getting to an RC when you have 8 questions in 10 minutes, and you skipping an entire RC is going to be detrimental to your score, right? Because it's 4 questions that you're giving up on an RC, and 4 continuous questions basically means, 4 continuous errors, right? The best thing to do is, that you have, your ideal time to solve an RC question is around 7 minutes, right? That is reading the passage and answering the 3 to 4 questions that follow. So what I would do is I would read the passage, right? I would spend 3 minutes in reading the passage. So I have a remaining 4 minutes. In the remaining 4 minutes, right, I would, in my mind, based on the practice test that I've taken, I have figured out that normally on harder RC questions, I struggle on the pick the data from the passage questions. I struggle with the inference based questions. But I'm very good at figuring out the main purpose. I'm very good at the anchor phrase questions. So what I would do, out of the 4 questions, right, I would spend a minute, right? I have 3 minutes where I've read the passage. I would spend a minute. If I get a main purpose passage, I would spend that minute 10 seconds to make sure it's right. I would spend that minute 10 seconds to make sure the anchor phrase is right. But I'm very hesitant. I'm very, hesitant. I don't know. I've read the inference questions, but I'm not able to figure out what needs to be done. So what I'm going to do is, because I worked with such questions before on the practice test, I found out that inference based questions and say the pick the data questions are my weak area. I would skip on those 2 and move on. So instead of skipping 4 entire questions, right, what have I done? I've utilized 5 minutes, right? I've answered 2, and I know I'm pretty sure about my answers for those 2, but I've skipped the other 2, right? So I have 3, 4, 5. I have answered 4 questions. I'm sure about 2. I've got 2 wrong. Now I'm left with 6, or left with 4 questions and a pretty decent 5 minutes to answer, right? And ideally, what happens after you get a bad RC passage, they're going to follow it up with some SC questions and CR questions. So as soon as I see an SC question, I know that's going to be a time saver for me. So I'm definitely going to solve for the SC question, right? But when I see the CR question, and I found out that CR question again now deals with an bold face question, right? Say suddenly on my 34th question, I have exactly 3 minutes left, and a bold face question comes up. I'm not very confident on my bold face questions. My entire error log over all the material that I worked with gives me only a 60% accuracy on bold face questions. So what I would do, I would just say, okay, there's no point in me thinking of putting more time on this question, because my accuracies are anyway not high. I would skip on the 34th, and I would spend time on the 35th and the 36th. I would give each of them a minute and a half to get done with the 3 minutes of time. Okay. So this is where you'll have to be very, very careful in your analysis when you're practicing. So while you're practicing, right, especially in a timed manner with the quant review and the verbal review, always make a note of the average time that you spend on specific types of questions, right? I know for a fact that in my case, the average time that I spent on any question that was a word problem was ideally 2 minutes 15 seconds, right? But the time that I spent on a question which dealt with number systems was only a minute and a half, right? So I knew in my mind what would be the time that I require to solve that question in a very comfortable manner, right? If I'm put out of my comfort zone, I would take a hit on questions that I'm not comfortable with. And by taking a hit on questions I'm not comfortable with, I'm actually saving on time and transferring that time to try attempt questions that I'm very, very comfortable with. Got it? And you see that I'm skipping 2 questions in a very, very, nice manner, because I'm first not getting 4 questions in an RC passage continuously wrong. I'm okay with losing out on those 2 questions because I was anyway not very confident on those 2 questions. Okay. So you have to figure out what is the time spent on every question of a particular topic, and you have to figure out what is your accuracy percentage on that topic, right? So if you find out that for a strength and weaken question, the time spent is only 1 minute 45 seconds and your accuracy is 90%, now that's a question that you would never skip. But if you feel in a bold-faced question, right, the time spent is 2 minutes, but your time spent is 2 minutes 10 seconds, but your accuracy is only 60%. That is a question that I would earmark to skip if I'm running short of time. Got it? All of y'all. So this is what I would recommend to all students. And how do you figure out this time? Based on how you practice, right? From the OG verbal review and quant review, the verbal review and the quant review specifically, and also how you take up practice tests from the GMAT prep test, right? Okay with this, guys? Any question on the correlation between time spent and accuracy, and you're understanding, right, why I'm saying this? Because for every student, the time spent and the accuracy percent would be different, and for every student, the strengths and weaknesses would be different, right? Of course, see, Saroj, you need to understand that I'm running short of time, right? It's better for me to skip 2 questions in 2 questions of the RC and make sure the other questions are right, rather than working with 3 questions and leaving 3 questions unanswered. Leaving questions unanswered gives you a bigger penalty, than getting those questions wrong. Okay, so Ruchir, I already mentioned how many questions out of the 36 will be a ballpark split, right? When I asked you to work with a verbal review, I said 10 questions of sentence correction, 10 questions of CR, and 4 RC passages, because normally that's how the entire test would pan out. Okay, if you're really unlucky, that's when you get 3 passages, because if you get 3 passages, they are going to be really long passages. Okay, and you might get 3 to 4 questions each and within them. And for quant, right, the ideal splits would be 17 questions from problem solving and 14 questions from data sufficiency. In every mock, if I'm unable to answer the last 4 to 5 questions, we would try to skip 1 question every 10. See, Vidya, you need to understand that you need to understand that you're asking me this question because you're not managing time on the questions that you've started the test with, right? So if you're already running behind time, right, then obviously you'll have to skip questions in between. So my bigger problem here, Vidya, is why are you in that scenario where you have to skip 1 question every 10 questions, right? The reason you're in that scenario is because, one, when you're working on questions, you're still utilizing the roundabout approach to get to an answer. That means your review process on the questions is not very foolproof, right? That's why I'm asking you to focus on the review process, because, one, when you see a question, if you know the correct process strikes you quickly, right, there itself, you're going to save time. The biggest reason why students or test takers spend too much time on a question is because when they see the question, right, they spend time figuring out what do I do in that question. So once they spend 30 seconds on what to do on the question, they spend another 30 seconds to set things up, and then another 1.5 minutes to solve, right? So what happens is the first 30 seconds, because you didn't identify what to do, you didn't identify the first step, that's where you ran short of time. So when you look at a question and you review the question, right, and you realize, okay, for this type of question, it made more sense to introduce only X rather than X and Y. Then you know that that's a pattern that you can carry over or carry forward to all the other questions that you work with. Ajanya, okay, I'll give you the OG 2019 and the 2020 template. Okay, I made the 2020 template just because I was coming into the webinar. I want to give the students a takeaway. All right. Okay with this, guys, all of y'all understand what I meant by the time spent and the accuracy here, and how you need to measure the time spent and accuracy for certain questions, and you figure out, right, what are your weak areas, and you figure out what are your strengths. I would definitely want to spend more time on questions that I know I'm sure to get right, rather than spend time on questions I'm not very sure to get right. Okay. The fourth is understanding what sunk cost bias on GMAT questions is. Anybody? Can anybody tell me what sunk cost bias exactly is? Can anybody quickly tell me what sunk cost bias means? Okay, so since exactly right. So a sunk cost bias is basically, let's take an example, right? You purchased a ticket, right, to go and see a Manchester United football match, right? Say in Manchester, right? And say Manchester United are playing say Arsenal, right? And you're waiting 2 months to go to that match. But what happens suddenly is you realize that there's a storm. Your flight is cancelled. You know Roads are like flooded. You have now you're obviously stuck at home, but at home you're most safe, right? You have like a fireplace. You can sit on, you can sleep under, underneath your blanket. You can actually look at the entire match on the television. Have like a big bowl of popcorn. It saves me all the travel expenses. It saves me all the jet lag, right? The sunk cost bias is basically you feeling bad about the fact that you spent money on purchasing the ticket, right? You don't concentrate on what positive you have at this point of time, because the alternate that you have is you're still not going to miss the match. You're not going to see it live, but you're still going to see it on the television, right? So what you can do is you can take that ticket and put it into the fireplace and just add it as extra firewood of sorts, right? And forget about the cost that you spent on it, but look at the alternative that you have. And that is what happens, right? When you lose out on time, right? When you lose out on time and you feel that you've not answered some questions previously, right? You have some doubt in your head. If you let that doubt, right, affect the other questions, it's going to be a complete downer from there, right? The best way or the best strategy to work with on the GMAT is to always look at a question, treat it with respect then and there, let go of that question if you're not getting it. If you're getting it, well and good, move on. But when you move on, don't influence how you work the next question based on what you've done before. Okay? Many students come and ask me when we work with questions in class, what level was this question? What level was this question, right? See, you ideally shouldn't be thinking of all of that, right? What levels are this question? What levels are this question? When you're working a set of 20 questions or you're working a set of 31 questions on the test, because you in your head, right? If you look at a question and you feel it's very hard for you to solve, for some other person, it would be very easy to solve. And the reason why we don't ask you to figure and categorize the questions into easy, medium, and hard, because you don't have data on what kinds of questions are easy, medium, hard. So on test day, right, never critically analyze a question. Don't assume that a bold-faced question will only come in the harder levels of questions, or questions on probability. Permutations and combinations will only come at harder levels, right? All questions can be tested at any level in any capacity. So never let your performance on the previous questions govern your performance on the questions that follow further. Even if you get a 31st question on quant, right, which tells you x is equal to 2, y is equal to 3, what is the value of x plus y? You just treat that question as a standalone, mark the answer and move on. You don't worry about why did I get this question at this stage, right? Because for all you know, it may be a experimental question as well, right? And for those of you who don't know this, on the quant section, right, out of 31 questions, 3 questions are experimental. And on the verbal section, out of 36 questions, 6 questions are experimental. Okay? So 31 questions, 3 experimental questions, 36 questions, 6 experimental questions, right? So even if you get a question, right, it may have been experimental. You can't go and, do like a in-depth analysis of why you got such an easy question on the 31st, right? It's just going to, hamper your entire verbal section that follows. Got it? All of y'all? Okay. Now, the last point that I want to make is something called the flight or the fight syndrome, right? Like I said, it's just a follow-up to the previous point that I had. Now, somebody asked me, right, what is the ideal time that you would take to skip a question, right? And I answered it in some way, because I said the average time spent and the accuracy percent, right, that I know in my head for particular questions. If I'm crossing that, I know I'm not going to solve, I'm not going to spend more time, I'm going to skip on that question and move on, right? Ideally, on a quant question, if you find yourself spending more than 2 minutes 30 seconds on any question, that is a clear indicator to you that I need to skip and move on, right? If you find the quant question and you find that that question is on probability, and you find that the time spent on probability is very high and the accuracy percent on probability is very low, instead of me sitting and spending 2.5 minutes on that question and having a higher probability of getting that probability question wrong, I would just use maybe 30 seconds to glance at what kind of question is given to me. If it's an easy probability question, I would maybe chase it. If it is a question, it's a probability question that I know that it's not, it's a little mind-boggling for me, I would let go of that question, save that 2 minutes or 1 minute 30 seconds, and apply it on a question that I know for sure that I can solve. Okay, that's what I meant. So if you want to have like a time limit after which you skip, I'm saying the time limit should be around 2 minutes 30 seconds on questions that you know you can solve, and you should quickly make a decision on questions that you know that you're going to spend too much of time on. Okay, because what I always tell my students again is, in addition to you knowing quant and verbal, right, the GMAT is a test of your decision making, right? It's how quick you decide on what process you're going to use to solve that question. And in addition to this, it's not about what process you decide only, it's also what types of questions you let go that is going to define your entire score, right? So what kinds of questions you let go? Questions which are taking you more than 2.5 minutes to solve, and questions that you feel that are complex, you're already running short of time, and you don't want to take a risk because your accuracy percent on those questions are low. Let it go. So that's what I meant by the flight or the fight syndrome, right? You should know when to let go of a question, and you should know when to actually fight on that question. So if I see a question and it's a word problem, I'm very confident of my word problems, but I know they're going to take time, I would give that question a good part of 2 minutes 30 seconds. Okay, but if it's a question on permutations, combinations, probability, which most students are not comfortable with, I would let go of that question. All right, see what happens, right? And again, I always say this to all of my students, it doesn't matter on whether you win the battle with that question during the test, right? It matters whether you win the war towards the end. So even if you got like 2 questions wrong, which you knew that if I'd sat with a, maybe with time not being, pressure to me, I would have got those questions right. Even if you'd got those questions wrong, you lost the battle with those 2 questions, but you ended up getting a 49 or a 50 on quant, then, the end result is what matters, not what you lost, right? And anyway, this question is going to come up. So for people wondering how many questions does it take for you to get a 49, right? How many questions can you afford to get wrong? 6 to 7 questions you can afford to get wrong to end up getting a 49 on quant, right? If you're looking at a 50 on quant, right, you can only afford 3 to 4 questions, to go wrong. And if looking at a perfect 51 on quant, you can only afford around 0 to 2 questions to go wrong. Okay. On the verbal front, if you're looking to score beyond the 40 on verbal, you cannot afford more than 6 errors. Okay, 6 to 7 errors. If you want to score anywhere between a 35 and a 40, you should have not more than 9 errors on your test. If your errors go into double digits, right, that's when your score drops to lesser than 35. Okay. No, Vidya, experimental questions are between 11 and 28. All of that is a myth. The experimental questions can come at any point in your test. Okay, it can come in the first question as well. Prabhat, if you're looking at a quant 51, right, then ideally anybody who's looking for a quant 51 should not let go of questions, because you can only maximum get around 1 to 2 errors, right? So in your case, I would say that you have to answer every question. If you're running short of time, no, instead of you spending time on that question and ending up with a 49, it's better for you to end up with a 50. And you'll need to understand that getting a 51 on quant is on test day. Okay, because if you end up making 2 or 3 silly errors, that's going to cost you and you will drop to a 50, right? So you have to be very, very, very careful and meticulous on test day if you're looking at a 51. Saroj, I don't think, this is a webinar where I'm going to explain what experimental questions are. Experimental questions are basically questions that the GMAT puts, which don't affect your test result, but they utilize the data from the experimental questions to design questions for further GMAT, okay, attempts. If we skip few questions on GMAT, will there be a penalty and henceforth drastically decrease my score? You can't skip questions, Amrita. So when you're telling me skip few questions, I'm assuming that you're guessing the answer and you're moving on. Okay, you can't skip questions on the GMAT, right? You just can't say I'll skip the question without answering something. So if you see, if you're skipping a question, right, and as soon as you take a hit on a question very quickly, my advice is on the next two questions, just make sure you spend some time and get those questions right. Because I told you, right, if you skip 3-4 questions at a go, then it becomes continuous string of errors, and continuous string of errors is not what is ideal. Okay. Yes, Quant 44 on the actual GMAT means the student has not seen harder questions itself. We'll come to this question of OG and all later, guys. Okay, so I'll speak about how you need to go about your prep a little later. Okay, perfect. So these are the points that I want you to consider, right? So now coming to the most important part of what I would suggest as a quant timing strategy, and this, remember, is your timing strategy that I would want you to utilize on test day and all practice tests and practice questions. Okay. So what normally Arun and I recommend is on the quant front, right? You have 62 minutes, okay? And you have a total of 31 questions. I would prefer that every student divide that 62 minutes into 3 sections of 15 minutes each. So 15, 15, 15 would give you 45. And the last section should have 17 minutes. And the number of questions, right, that I would recommend is 7 questions in the first 15 minutes, 8 questions in the next 15, 8 questions in the next 15, and 8 questions in the last 17. This is the ideal time split that we recommend every student to take up the quant section, right? So basically you'll realize, right, once you take up the practice test, that the clock that is there on the GMAT is a clock that doesn't tick up, right? It ticks down. So if you're looking at the clock, so 62 minus 15, right? So at the 47-minute mark, right, you should have completed, right, 7 questions. Got it? And you see how I'm keeping lesser number of questions and more time on the first and the last few questions, because in the first set of questions, right, you're ideally, more nerves would come in, so you'll spend a little extra time that you normally would in the first 10 questions. So I'm catering to that. And you see in the last few questions, right, I'm giving you some more time to work with things, because if your test has gone well, if you answered the first 3 quarters really well, then the last questions that you get, the last quarters would be questions of higher levels. And normally what happens with questions at higher levels, you will have to spend that extra 10 to 20 seconds to get to an answer. Got it? So my advice, split the entire 62 minutes into 3 sections of 15 and 1 section of 17. And the number of questions you have to target is 7, 8, 8, and 8. So 8 3 is 24. 24 plus 7 gives you the 31. Okay, all of y'all. This is something that it's full proven of sorts, because we've always told our students to work with this. They have utilized this and they have told us, right, that this definitely works. So what happens also, so if you realize that you're running short of time, isn't it? Say 30 minutes of your test is down, right? 30 minutes basically means you need to finish 8 plus 7, 15 questions. But you just finished the 14th question. You've just finished the 14th question. And you see that the clock is already ticked down, right? Ideally, you should have started the 16th question for now. So what you would do, instead of spending time on that 15th question and going behind time, you would take a hit on the 15th question. You would quickly look at the question, skip it, and move on, right? So that you're not deviating from this entire process. And it is okay. It is absolutely fine to take a hit in between, rather than everything, compounding and you getting like 4 to 5 errors towards the end, right? Because your accuracy is going to be taken, your score is going to be given based on your accuracies on the entire 31 question set that you have, okay, and not for the the first 10 or the last 10 questions, right? So this is the timing strategy that we would recommend for quant. Now coming to verbal. So verbal here, you're going to have 36 questions and you're going to have 65 minutes, right? So here I would want all of you all to split your time into 3 sections of 15 and one last section of 20 minutes, right? And you have a total of 36 questions, isn't it? So when you have 36 questions, I would want all of you all to try to wrap up 8 questions in the first 15, 8 in the second, 8 in the third, and try to wrap up the remaining. That's 12 questions in the last 20 minutes. And the reason why I'm giving you 12 questions in a 20-minute section here, right, is because for 95% of the students who take up the test, you would have one brutal RC in this last set of questions, right? You would have one RC in this last 12 questions, which is anyway going to, throw you off guard in terms of time. So it's better for you to, prepare for that scenario. That does not mean that, you might get a test taker who doesn't get an RC in the last, right? You might get a person who gets all the RCs in the first 3 quarters, but I'm saying 95% of the case, the RCs are nice and spread out, right? You're never going to find 2 RCs coming in together, right? You're going to always find an RC and then you're going to have that followed by CR and SC questions and so on. And ideally, you'll always have an RC in your last set of questions, okay? So you try to cater to that towards the end. So your target should always be 8 questions in 15 minutes in the first 3 quarters and 12 questions in 20 minutes in your last quarter. Got it? All of y'all? So again, 30 minutes has expired and you realize that you're only on the 15th question or on the 14th question. You're ideally supposed to be on the 16th question. My advice would be skip on the 15th or skip on the 16th and go on and move on further, and right, make sure you take a hit in between rather than having all those questions compound your matters further in the end. All right. So that's the verbal strategy that we would recommend. Quant strategy would be 15, 15, 15, 17. And your question should be 7, 8, 8, and 8. And for verbal, 15, 15, 15, 20. And that would be 8, 8, 8, and 12. Okay. Any questions about these 2 strategies? If you're looking at a 40 plus, you'll need, I told you, right? You cannot afford more than 6 to 7 errors. Obviously, Ashutosh, the middle section would take you a little more time, right? Because if you've done well on the first set of questions, the questions start becoming slightly harder, right? So when the questions start becoming harder, it doesn't become harder in terms of math. It becomes harder in terms of reasoning. So 2 things you'll have to look at, Ashutosh. One, am I approaching the question right? Am I putting too much emphasis on the quant aspect, and I'm bringing in reasoning to get to an answer, right? And second thing you'll have to understand is, okay, if I'm running short of time in the middle section, I've given you that split of 15, 15, 15, 17, right? So if you see in the middle section, 30 minutes, you're running short, you're running behind 2 questions, it's better to skip on 2 questions and to move further. It's always better to take a hit in between and come back on par with the timing rather than, keeping that as a domino effect towards the end. Parth, we'll come to that later, right? How to use the OG if you haven't created the error log is something later. Ashutosh, just for you, right? Since you brought that point out, right? What I meant, by saying that you should learn to, on the harder levels of questions, you should learn to use the best approach to solve. Is think about this, right? Suppose I'd given you this data and I tell you the ratio of boys to girls in the class is 2:3. And I'd asked you, and the question finally asks you, how many girls are in the class? Now, what normally people would do, right? They treat GMAT math as math. So what they would do is they would create equations. They would say the boys would be 2x, the girls would be 3x. They would see what the question says, create the equations, get to a equality, and then solve that equality for x, right? But if the question gives me some data like this, if I bring in reasoning, things become a little easier. Say the ratio of boys to girls is 2:3, and they ask me how many girls are in this class, and they give me 5 answer choices, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. You know what I would do? I would just knock off directly 8 and 10 and 11. Think about it, right? This is, and I've actually pulled out some data from an official GMAT question. Okay, this is how an official GMAT question would be. I can directly knock off answer choices alpha, Charlie, and delta. Why? Because I know, looking at that ratio 2:3, the number of girls has to be a multiple of 3 and the number of boys has to be a multiple of 2, right? So you see what I meant? I didn't need to actually use entire math equations to get to an answer, right? I could have got to an answer in a much more simplistic manner and got to an answer like a minute and a half, rather than, spending 2.5 minutes on setting up those equations. So that is what I meant by bringing in logic. Okay. And as we go further, and I have some slides here where we'll actually look at questions where, I'll show you how to save time. Got it? So any questions on the 2 timing strategies, guys? So I all okay with the timing strategies that I gave you? And this is something I would definitely want all of you all to implement, okay, once you start taking a practice test and you start doing timed practice. Got it? Sharath, I already dealt with it later, right? I told you at least 7 to 8 minutes is the time that you take to spend on an RC question. Okay. So I'm going to the next part of the slide. Okay. Now somebody asked me what would be the best strategy to guess on quant, right? The best way, if you want to save time on some quant questions, you want to work it out faster, you want to guess on quant and move on, is to always be aware of your answer choices, right? Like I gave you an example, no? If I give the data of boys is to girls as 2:3, and I see that the answer choices give me some values which are not multiples of 3, I would eliminate them. So always be aware of your answer choices, okay? And try to use the process of elimination to eliminate choices which are illogical. On data sufficiency questions, when you always, when in the beginning itself, when you're starting your prep, please buy into the ADBC approach of working, right? Because how do you get ADBC? AD and BC depends upon the sufficiency or the insufficiency of the first statement, right? So if the first statement is sufficient, you would put AD, and the first statement is insufficient, you would put BCE, right? So even if you're not able to solve for the second statement, you can pick one out of AD and pick one out of BCE and move on. So, right. So always when you solve data sufficiency questions, get that structured process of using the ADBC approach. And obviously, right, the best guessing strategy on quant is to always play devil's advocate. So what happens, right, if you have a data sufficiency question and clearly without you doing any working, right, you just look at the question, you look at the 2 statements, and you see that the 2 statements, obviously, when I put them together, would suffice. That is a clear indicator to you that that question might be a C trap. What is a C trap? Any question you see, the 2 statements together without any mathematical working will definitely seem together sufficient to you. So that's a clear indicator that, okay, I'm not going to get my answer in 5 seconds or 10 seconds. See, any answer, right, that you pick on math or verbal in 5 seconds is ideally an answer choice that I would take a step back and recheck, right? So it's always better not to pick C at that point, but pick something out of A and B, because you've not worked with the statements individually. Got it? Classic C traps are the ones you'll have to always be careful about, right? And what are the best questions to guess on the GMAT? I told you, questions on topics that you're weak at, right? The time saved can always be spent on something that you're more comfortable to work with, right? And that again ties into what I told you in terms of time spent per question and the accuracy percent, right? So on how important it is for you to figure out what is your average time on these types of questions and what are your accuracy rates on these types of questions. And then based on that, decide on what questions you would let go and what questions you would not, right? So like I told you, right, and somebody mentioned, I get bogged down in the middle section of quant. I have one question for you here, okay? And I'm going to show you why people, spend too much of time on questions, and why at some points, you can actually make a logical pick and move on. So same rules apply here. I'm going to give you a question. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to solve, right? The average time that you get on the GMAT. I want all of you all to give me an answer. Just please don't type in the answer in the chat window. Once I ask you to do so, that's when you type it in, please. Okay? So I'm going to give all of you all 2 minutes. Your time starts now. Guys, please don't type in the answers in the chat window until I ask you to do so, okay? Because I don't want the others to look at the answers when they are solving. Okay, you can start typing your answers in the chat window, please. Okay. The reason I've chosen this question, right, is because it's an official GMAT question, and the reason why I picked it is, one, to show you sometimes if you're not able to get an answer, right, you can actually pick a very logical answer and move on, right? Now think about it like this. Think about it like this, right? Ideally, when you solve this question, you have an is equal to 1 by n minus 1 by n plus 1. Okay. I purposely made this question slightly harder by changing the answer choices. But what the GMAT would ideally do, right, is they would give you answer choices in such a way that every answer choice would make sense if a student makes a mistake. But if you're slightly aware, your critical reasoning skills are slightly stronger, right, you can actually eliminate answer choices which are illogical. The best way to solve this question was to go conventional, right? And when you need to solve any questions where you need to find out patterns, always start small. So a1 would be 1 minus half. So some people would have put this as half. A2 will be half minus 1 by 3. Some people would have put this as 1 by 6. A3 will be 1 by 3 minus 1 by 4, which is 1 by 12, and A4 will be 1 by 4 minus 1 by 5, which is 1 by 20. Now, for those of you all who put this to be the values, right? Half, 1 by 6, 1 by 12, 1 by 20, you would have realized that it becomes very difficult for you to figure out the patterns between the numbers here. But for those who just kept the question unpacked, right, without actually changing these into values, you'd have realized you would have got your answer quicker, because what you have to basically do is to add up all the terms, right? So I'm adding A1 plus A2 plus A3 plus A4, and the pattern that I recognize here is if I add up all of these, the half would cancel, the 1 by 3 would cancel, and the 1 by 4 would cancel. And that leaves me with 1 minus 1 by 5, right? So if I continue the same pattern and I write things up to A99 and A100, everything would cancel except for the first and the last terms, right? And the first and the last terms should be 1, and the last term will be 1 by 101. Agree? And clearly the answer would be 100 by 101. So this is for a person who identifies the pattern in the question, right? So the takeaway here, right, and for those who've attended my sessions in Koramangala, I remember when we discussed the question, I said the takeaway on this question is, when you're looking for patterns in sequence questions, never solve the entire question, right? Never make the question into a definite number. Always keep things unpacked, right? It becomes easier for you to solve. But even for those, right, even for those who got the 1/2 and 1/6 and 1/12 and 120, you could have at least ballparked your answer. You could have figured out what can be a logical pick out of these, right? Because what you're going to end up doing is you're going to add up half, 1 by 6, 1 by 12, and 1 by 20, and the next number is going to be lesser than 1 by 20 and further, right? So I know for a fact my answer has to be greater than half. So if the answer choices, right, if the answer choices were not like the ones I've given you, but if the answer choice had like 1 by 100 or a 1 by 101, I would directly knock off these answer choices because I know my answer has to be greater than half, right? And you'll realize that it's going to be greater than half, but the fractions that you're going to add, right, to half are going on reducing. So if they're going on reducing, right, the safest answer choices for me to pick would be any one out of C, D, and E rather than to pick A and B, because A and B, if I look at it in terms of a fraction form, crosses 1, right? But you see here, the pattern that I'm looking at is the fractions keep reducing to smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller terms, right? So ideally, if I go on writing things, if I'm going to add smaller fractions to 0.5, my answer is going to tend towards 1. Remember in school, you used to learn something called limits. So I could have easily knocked off answer choice alpha and answer choice beta. But you'll realize, you see that Charlie, Delta, and Echo are questions where I'm not going to be able to eliminate because I know, all three values are going to be less than 1. So what I would do at this point is I wouldn't randomly guess 1 out of 5 and move on. I would eliminate 2 answer choices. Sometimes if you're lucky, 3 answer choices would eliminate, and it still gives me a 33.33% probability of getting that question right. Okay. So the focus on this question, right, in terms of my lecture here, is not on how to get to the right answer, is what if you're not able to find the patterns on test day. If you're not able to find the patterns on test day, right, your mind, you should tune your mind to such a extent that, okay, I've not got it, I can still look at the answer choices and figure out what can be a logical pick out of the two. That's why, remember when I said the ratio of boys to girls is 2:3, and I ask you how many girls are in the class. If I'm not able to solve the question right, I would just look at the question answer choices and I would pick one which is a multiple of 3, and I would eliminate the ones which are not multiples of 3, right? And that's making an educated guess rather than a blind guess out of 1 out of 5. Okay, got it? So somebody asked me, right, so why do I get stuck in the middle section? The reason you get stuck in the middle section is because many people will not look at the ideal approach of solving sequences, right? The solving sequences, no, you don't simplify the entire unpacking of questions, right? If you simplify, people will start using a lot of time to work with these values, right? So you see how important the approach is to get to the answer quickly. And even if you're not getting to an answer, right, you need to learn how to make an educated guess. Okay with this, guys, all of you all? Okay, so just one more question along the same lines. Okay, and even if you don't get an answer, fine. But like I said, right, your mind should go towards, okay, how do I now logically get to an answer? What would be the most logical of the answer choices to pick out of the 5? So again, here's your next question. Um, I'll give you like 2 minutes again. Your time starts now. Okay, you can start typing your answers in the chat window, please. Perfect. So most of you have taken on board what I told you. Trust me, if you were aware of what the question asks you, and you were aware of your answer choices, and this is how you look at things, right? As soon as you see that you're multiplying a set of values or you're adding a set of values, and it's a huge sequence of values that you need to add or multiply, right? And you see that your answer choices, your 5 answer choices, gives you answer choices are very close to each other, but all the units digit of the answer choices are different. You can always make use of your answer choices to your advantage. Directly without any qualms, I would say that the answer is 40 here without any working. Okay, my initial attempt would be just to pick 40 and move on. I wouldn't bother about this question further. Mark it in 20 seconds and go further. Anybody can explain why I would just pick 40 and move on? Any logical explanation to this, please? I'm not even creating an equation. Okay, so for some people who create the equation, I saw that x plus 10y 11y is equal to something. I'm not even creating an equation here, right? Why would I just pick 40 and move on? Anybody? Perfect, right? Because the last digit 350, the last digit in 350 is a 0, right? And think about it, if I only have terms which are 7 and 77s, right? And if you look at the tables, right, of 7, 7 ones are 7, 7 twos are 14, 7 threes are 21, 7 fours 28, 7 fives 35, 7 six are 42, 7 sevens are 49, 7 eights are 56, 7 nines are 63. The only time that I can get a unit digit 0 is if it's 7 into 10, 70, or 7 into 20, which is 140, right? So I know the number of sevens has to be a multiple of 10. And that's where I would just randomly pick 40 and move on if I have, exactly one value which is 40, right? If I had 50, then I would think a little carefully, right? Of maybe eliminating the other choices, then work with 40 and 50 together. But this is an official question, okay? I've just taken it from GMAT Club word for word and I've put it onto this slide just for me to make that point that you see the GMAT is a test of logic. It's a test of reasoning. I don't need to set up equations to get to an answer. As long as you realize that you're going to get a string of sevens, and the only way you can get a unit digit of 0 is if you have the number of sevens to be a multiple of 10, you could have picked 40 and moved on. But if you went logically, if you went mathematically, no, then you say let the number of sevens be x and let the number of 77s be y. So obviously the number of sevens plus the 77 should add up to 350. That's one equation you form. Then you can take 7 common. X plus 11y is equal to 350. And 7 ones are 7 fives are. So x plus 11y is equal to 50. Right? So that is the equation that you would form. X plus 11y is equal to 50. And now what you would do, the only way this equation can be satisfied is I'm going to take the answer choices and put it into the values, right? 11 into something can only give me something ending with 0 if y is a multiple of 10, right? And obviously x also has to be a multiple of 10 for me to have, or ending with 5 or ending with 10. But you realize here, if I create this equation, I will still have to use my answer choices and plug in and see which one of the answer choices will actually make sense, wouldn't it? So if I put x as 39, think about it. If I put x as 39, then y would have to be 1, right? And in this case, what will be x plus y? Because I need the total number of sevens, right? So x plus y has to be 40. Yes? And this is what we have in the answer choices. So what you'll have to end up doing is you'll have to plug in values for x and y to figure out what adds up to 50. So at the end of the day, right, what happened in this question is if you created this equation, you still had to reason out what the correct numbers are going to be for you to plug in for x and y. But if you realize that the number of sevens is what I need basically added up, and the only way I can get number of sevens added up to give me a unit digit 0 is when I have a multiple of 10, then 40 would be your ideal pick. So the point I'm making, right, and this is where, on the quant section you lose out on time, is because many students go about doing this, which is a way slower process than actually bringing in logic on questions, right? And this is where what I meant by the review process comes into play. Okay, all of y'all, any doubts on this? Any doubts on why I picked 0 as the answer? If all the terms are equal to 7, then directly it will be 50, Sanjana. I don't need to worry, no? Because if I need all terms to be equal to 7 and I have to get a sum of 350, then I know 7 into 50 will be 350, right? So that question would not be a GMAT question. No, it just tests you on multiplication then, right? Okay with this, guys? All of y'all? Sanjana, I'm just saying, if all were 7s, no, then I would get 50. 50 is not even one of my pick here, right? Correct, but 50 is not even one of my pick, no? If I use all 7s, right? Think about it. 350 by 7 would be 50, right? Perfect. So let's try one more so that you get a sense of how you save time on the quant section. So here's your next question. Try this out, please. Okay, you can start typing an answer in the chat window, please. Guys, listen to what I had to say, right? If you're not getting an answer, no, I would want you to think about logic and think about what you can eliminate logically, right? And try to give me the best possible answer. So if you're not getting an answer, you tell me. It can be A or D or B, C, D, things like that, right? But I want you to learn to eliminate and not just randomly pick 1 out of 5. Okay. So again, looks like most of y'all have have thought through this question very well, and the answer choice is definitely C. But you'll realize, right, when you actually set this question up, if you start setting this question up with algebra, right, things become a little problematic, isn't it? Because you'll have to use three variables, x, y, z, and then out of that take two denominations, either xy or xz, and create an equation out of it and see what kind of values would satisfy that equation, right? So just by looking at that question, no, I know since I have to introduce three variables, my first instinct will be I'm not going to use those variables and create a algebraic equation. I'm just going to work with my answer choices. And for that, I'm just going to be slightly more structured, right? I have quarters, I have dimes, and I have nickels, right? And I know the total number of coins, is 6, right? And the amount is 0.70. The number of coins, I'll just put it here, the number is 6, and the amount is 0.70. And the key is here, the next part of the question says that there are only two denominations of coins among the 6 coins. So there are only two denominations. It can either be quarters or dimes, right? It can't be quarters, or in this case, it would be quarters, dimes, nickels, quarters, nickels. But since the question asks me, in Pat's hand, how many nickels is he holding? So basically, this last part of the question tells me that one type of coin he definitely has in his hand is nickels, right? If he's definitely going to have nickels, the only possible combinations you can have are nickels and quarters and nickels and dimes, because the question clearly says he only has two denominations, right? And I know the number of coins he should have is a total is 6. Agree? So think about this, right? If the number of nickels were going to be odd, right? If the number of nickels is going to be odd and there only has to be two denominations, obviously you'll need to know the conversions of quarters, dimes, and nickels, right? So quarter is basically 25 cents. A dime basically is 10 cents. And a nickel is 5 cents, right? Just by looking at the answer choices here, no, I know that answer choice B and answer choice D, right, would be slightly illogical for me. Because if he's going to have 3 5-cent coins or 3 nickels, 5 into 3 would give me a total of 15 cents. And the deficit here would be 0.70 minus 15, which is 55 cents. So if I have a deficit of 55 cents, I cannot divide the 55 cents into dimes or quarters, right? So I know B would be a very illogical pick. And if I keep him to have 6, right? Think about 5, right? If I keep D to be 5 cents, one nickel is 5 cents. And if he has 5 nickels, 5 into 5 would make it 25 cents. So now the deficit would be 45 cents. I cannot have dimes to contribute to 45 cents or nickels to contribute to 45 cents, right? So clearly for me, answer choice B and answer choice delta are very illogical. I'm not even going into touching them. And the question asks you, if there are only two denominations of coins among the 6 coins, how many nickels is he holding? 6 will be a very illogical pick, right? If he's holding all 6 nickels, it's going against the question which says there are only two denominations. So basically using logic, I've just eliminated 3 answer choices, B, D, and E. The only things I'm left out with is A and C, correct? So if I work with A, if he has 2 nickels, so basically the amount of money he has in terms of cents would be 10 cents. So the deficit now would be 60 cents. And the only way for me to make sure this deficit of 60 cents is taken care of is if I divide 60 by 10 to give me 6 dimes. But this won't make sense, right? 6 dimes plus 2 nickels would make it 8 coins. But the question tells me that there are only a total of 6 coins. And I know 60 cannot be divisible by 25. So taking quarters will just not make sense. So I can knock off alpha and I'm left out with only one possible answer choice, and that's Charlie. And it'll make sense now, right? Because if he has 4 nickels, the amount of cents he's going to have is 20 cents. And the deficit now is 50 cents, right? It doesn't make sense for me to say 50 cents to clear the deficit. I would take 5 dimes. 5 plus 4 would make it 9 coins. But 50 cents, I can have 2 quarters, right? So 2 quarters plus 4 nickels would give me the 70 cents that I want and the 6 coins that I want. So you see how important it is for you to figure out what is the approach that you're going to use on a quant question, right? And that is what ends up saving you time, right? If you end up creating equations out of this, creating two equations saying that either it can be quarter and nickels or dimes and nickels, and then working with it, you'll realize that at the end of the day, you'll still have to substitute for the variables to see what possible split would give you a total of 6, right? Because you have one equation that number of coins would be 6. But if you use your answer choices and bring in reasoning as well, bringing in logic, you'll realize that I can knock off 3 and 5 because I cannot have them to be odd numbers. And I can knock off 6 because the question will not make sense, right? You can't hold 6 coins, a total of 6 coins, and all 6 to be nickel and then also hold coins of 2 denominations. So out goes echo. So out of alpha and Charlie, I would use my answer choices and figure out what the exact answer choice would be, right? All of you all? Vince, it's the question you're asking me, right? It won't make sense, no, because a GMAT is a US based test, right? You're looking at, a US based test. So if it's a US based test, nobody's going to give you the conversions of money, right? So they expect you to know that $1 is, 100 cents, half a dollar is 50 cents. It's a US based test, right? So you'll have to know those conversions, right? Kaushal, no, ideally they don't give you official questions. $1 is so many cents, okay? Right? Normally they would give you conversions. Normally on official questions, they would give you conversions of things which are, complex conversion. For example, if they give you, say 1 feet, right? 1 foot, then they want you to convert things to inches. They will give you 1 foot is 12 inches. Okay, this conversion, no, they'll give you at the end of the question. But things like conversions of money, conversions of distance, conversions of time, conversions of speed, right? They will never give you in brackets. Nobody's going to tell you 1 hour is 3,600 seconds or 1 kilometer is 1,000 meters, right? But they would definitely give you conversions of 1 mile. They would tell you 1 mile is 1.6 kilometers if they want you to make that conversion. Okay. Even nobody's going to mention the value for pi, right? Nobody's going to give you pi is equal to 22 by 7 or 3.14 and so on, right? You're expected to know those basic conversions. All right. Okay with this, guys, all of y'all? Okay with what I meant by being smart on the approach that you use to save time? You'll have to be very smart, right, of where to use your answer choices and where to create equations. Now we looked at 3 questions on problem solving, right? So what do you do on data sufficiency, right? How do you save time on data sufficiency? Let's skip this question for now because we're running short of time. So how do you work with data sufficiency? And the reason I'm choosing this question, right, is because ideally, right, when it comes to number system questions and inequality questions, many people will go on, putting in values and trying to do a lot of mathematical calculation to solve. But the best way, right, the best way to save your time on data sufficiency questions is to not spend time on the statements too much, but it's always better to spend time on breaking down the question stem. If you're able to break down the question stem, no, your data sufficiency becomes very easy for you to solve, right? So I'm giving you a good 700 level question on the GMAT here, right? And you'll realize how simple it becomes once we discuss it. So your 2 minutes start now. Guys, just checking, is the audio fine? Because some of you all have complained that the audio is cutting in and out. If you confirm that the audio is fine, then for the guys who find an audio issue, just log out and log in, please. It should fix the issue. Guys, confirming quickly in the chat window. Audio is absolutely fine. Perfect. Okay, you can start typing your answer in the chat window, please. You'll understand why this is a 700 level question, because you'll already see in the chat window how many different answers everybody is giving me, right? So for the guys who attended classroom sessions of inequalities and absolute values, you need to get this question right, okay? Because we discuss things in depth. So for the guys who are not been exposed to inequalities and absolute values, don't worry. So this basically, the way I would solve this question is something of a take back for you. And there are certain things that you would not do for an inequality. So for some people, right, you would have taken the 1 by x minus y and multiplied by the y minus x on the right hand side. That's something you cannot do with inequalities, okay? So when you have x by y is greater than 1, no, you cannot just take the y this side and say x is greater than y. That's completely wrong, okay? That goes against the rules of inequality. So if you've done that, right, if you've done that this is where the review process comes into play. If you've done this, no, it's a clear indicator that your conceptual knowledge on inequalities is limited. So it's better for me to go and do a complete overview of, just go and learn those concepts again and do a complete overview of those concepts, okay? So for those of you all who didn't multiply, you all will have a lot of takeaways, right? So I'm going to go into the question here, okay? And why I always say that data sufficiency questions are actually easier than problem solving questions is because if you have the right approach, you'll realize that you don't need to actually solve everything. You just need to check if things are sufficient, right? But data sufficiency questions become trickier than problem solving because they involve more reasoning. Anything with more reasoning becomes a little problematic, right? That's why permutations, combinations is a topic that people don't like. But the key to solving any data sufficiency question, right, quickly, whether it's an inequality question or a number system question or a word problem, is to always learn to break down the question stem. If you're able to spend some time on the question stem, no, the statements will become easy. So the question stem says, is x1 divided by x minus y less than y minus x? Now there are three basic rules that you have to follow when you work with inequalities, and this is discussed, right? This will be discussed anyway during classroom sessions or online sessions. That when you work with inequalities, there are three hygiene factors you follow. Always keep the right hand side as 0. How do you keep the right hand side 0? By taking everything to the left hand side. And after you take everything to the left-hand side, simplify the left-hand side to a product or a division of values. Why? Because a product of values or a division of values is easier for me to analyze than an addition or a subtraction. You see, if I give you x into y is greater than 0, right? If I give you a product, then this is easy for me to analyze because all I can say is that both x and y have to have the same sign. But if I give you x plus y is greater than 0, right? If I have an addition or a subtraction in between, in addition to the signs of x and y, I'll also have to worry about the magnitudes of x and y, right? So always try to, keep the left-hand side as a product or division of values. And the third, wherever you have an option to get squared terms, maintain squared terms. Why? Because any even powered terms, right? The sign is always going to be positive. So if you want to break down the question stem in an inequality, these would be the points that you would note down, right? As you're learning the concepts, and you would try to apply it on questions, right? So I'm going to apply this on this question. I'm going to take everything to the left-hand side. So minus of y minus x is less than 0. So my first hygiene factor is taken care of. My second hygiene factor is I'm going to simplify the left-hand side to a product or a division of values. So I know I can take the LCM here and make this into a division of values, but there's something that catches my eye. And what catches my eye is the fact I have x minus y and x and y minus x here. And I said, right, whenever you have, you can always maintain squared terms. So what I would do, just to maintain that squared terms and make my life simpler, I would make this x minus y, y minus x as x minus y. So I would take the negative outside, it will become positive, into x minus y is less than 0. And now I can take the LCM. So x minus y, 1 plus x minus y whole square is less than 0. So this is in the exact type of analysis that I want, right? Because I have the right-hand side to be 0 and I have the left-hand side to be a division of values. And when I have things to be like a division or a multiplication of values, I know things have to work with signs, right? So I need the right-hand side to be less than 0. That means this has to be negative. And by looking at the numerator, I know the entire numerator, whatever values I take for x and y will always be positive. So for this entire equation to hold good, if the numerator is positive, what is important and what is the most important factor that I have to work for is to prove that x minus y is negative. So this question, right, is just asking you a very simple data sufficiency. Is x minus y less than 0? Or is x less than y? That's the question, right? So what I've done is, you see, I'm spending time on the question stem. I'm not going into the statements. And this is one big problem that test takers do, right? They always jump into the statements very quickly and overlook the information that the question stem provides. If you're able to break down the question stem, whenever you have an option to simplify, simplify it, right? And you see the question now asks me, is x less than y? And clearly looking at the second statement would definitely suffice, isn't it? Because the second statement tells me x is greater than y. And x is greater than y basically answers the question with a definite no. For people who don't understand what a data sufficiency question is, it's better you go and have a look at data sufficiency, right? But ideally on this type of question, right, a definite yes would be sufficient and a definite no would also be sufficient. So I know the second would always hold. You see, I don't need to now spend my time on the second statement. So what I would do is I would just not discard the first statement. I would still work with the first, right? And I need to prove whether x is less than y. So what I would do with this, like I said, try to maintain squared terms. So I would say x square plus y square. What can I do with this? Anybody? How can I simplify this? I will take the 4xy to the left-hand side, right? Is less than 0. So I can write this as x square plus y square minus 2xy. Minus 2xy is less than 0. And I know x square plus y square minus 2xy is x minus y whole square. Minus 2xy is less than 0. But see, by just looking at this statement, right, I know I cannot say anything about the sign of x and y, because the sign of x and y can be anything, right? X can be less than y, x can be greater than y. It depends upon the values and magnitudes I take for x and y. So that is enough sufficient grounds for me to knock off statement 1. So the statement 2 alone would be sufficient to solve. So the answer here has to be beta. So the point I'm making, right? The point I'm making is whenever you work with data sufficiency questions, the best strategy to follow to save time, right, is to always break down the question stem, right? Learn to break down the question stem, simplify the question, then get to an answer. It becomes way easier than having to put in values and solving algebraically. Got it? Okay. Okay, guys, all of y'all, any doubts on this question? Perfect. So that's what I had. That's what I had in, for the entire webinar. I had a couple of questions extra, but I think we've already, gone way past the time. So since it's already 9:30, I'll give you a quick 10-minute, Q&A session. So quickly you can ask me questions. Guys, just one thing, just don't ask me questions in terms of giving me your profile and saying, what do I do? Because that I don't have time for that. So ask me questions related in terms of your preparation, okay? Yeah, so the first question is somebody said only the OG as a source is enough. Guys, OG is one book, right? Now, what are the official material you have? You have the OG, you have the verbal review, you have the quant review, you also have the question bank that we provide. Now, the question bank that we provide is around 1,500 questions. It has retired questions of both quant and verbal. So all of these questions put together would be around 3,000 questions. Okay, so it's better for you to finish the official material first before using any other material. Didn't make the error log but completed OG. What can I do now? No problem, Parth. You can still work with the quant review and the verbal review and maintain an error log for that. Okay, I wouldn't go and waste my time and work the questions all over again when I already know the answers to it. Right? Which mocks would you recommend and how many during the course of prep? The only mocks that we would recommend are the official GMAT preps. You have 2 free, 4 paid ones. You would basically take the 4 paid ones in your last phase of prep, in your last 1 month, 1 practice test every weekend. If you've exhausted the 6 official GMAT preps, then the only test that we would recommend that you trust would be the Manhattan GMAT set of tests and the Veritas prep set of tests. Nothing else beyond it. And the only time you utilize Manhattan and Veritas is only if you've exhausted the official tests. Justin, on RC, does it matter if I take more than 3 minutes? If I take more than 3 minutes on a question to read the passage. Yes, Justin, basically you'll have to find that ideal time, right? In your case, to figure out how do I get done with the passage in 3 minutes and how do I focus on answering the question. See, you getting an understanding of the passage is not going to help you solve the question. So you should put more effort on answering the questions and getting like a gist of the passage, right? Don't try to go in depth in what the passage tells you. How do you improve logic and reasoning skills for quant? Monish, it's like you asking me, how do you understand the meaning of a paragraph in an RC, right? Logic and reasoning is something that needs to be built over a period of time. Okay, it's something that you cannot train your mind to do. Okay, it's like this. Some people know RC would come naturally to them because they've been in the process of reading for a long time, right? So developing logical and reasoning skills, one way is to work more and more questions and your mind becoming adept to identifying patterns, but it's something that normally comes naturally. Okay, so you can develop it to an extent, but for it to come naturally, you'll have to do it over a longer period of time. 2 months, how will 2 months be sufficient? Ideally, Vivek, if anybody is starting from scratch, right, we would say 3 months is the ideal time frame. Again, it would depend upon your official diagnostic test score, right? So if you have a confusion of how much time do I require in terms of prep, my advice would be take up a diagnostic test. If your diagnostic test gives you like something like a 550 and above, right, I think 2 months would suffice. But in the 2 months, you'll have to put in around 3 to 4 hours of prep. If your diagnostic score gives you something lesser than 500, then I would recommend that you phase your preparation out over 3 months. Expert Global is the reliable test series program. See, Robin, the only reliable test right out there, right, is the official preps, because they are the closest you can get to the official GMAT, right? I'm saying if you exhaust those tests, if you've exhausted the 6 official tests, that is when you look at other tests. The only test that I would personally recommend is the Manhattan GMAT and Veritas prep. right? I wouldn't recommend any other test. Even if Crack Verbal would have said they have their own test, no, I would still tell you that the official tests are the best way to go. Okay, so I'm being as blunt as I can be. Okay, is the only question bank only for DS? Vinay, we give you a question bank, right? Once for any students enrolled, no, you get a question bank where the questions are segregated for verbal, SEC or RC, and the questions are segregated for quant, arithmetic, algebra, stats, and geometry. And within those questions, you have PS and DS as well, right? What is an error log during accuracy practice? Sorry, what is an error log during accuracy practice? An error log is a data set or an Excel sheet that you make, Sonal, to log in your answers of the questions that you've solved. Right? It's like I give you more data, right? If I give you 10 questions, in those 10 questions, for which topics, how many you've got right, how many you've got wrong, I put it in a sheet. Then I take another 20 questions, I add to that data. So as I go on adding data, no, and I get data of around 200 questions I've solved. And if I analyze that data, right, I can actually figure out what types of what areas I'll need to focus on and what areas are my strong points. Okay, so an error log is basically a simple Excel sheet that you can maintain to say to populate or to fill in the correct to fill in the answer, the correct and the wrong answers for whatever questions you work with. Anyway, I'm going to send you guys. I'll ask my marketing team to send you OG 2020 tracker sheet and the OG 2019 tracker sheet. So what I can ask them to do is they send you an email, maybe with the PDF of the slides that I've used in the session, and also with the tracker sheet attached to it, right? So they can send it to you by tomorrow or day after max. Okay, so everybody who's attended the webinar will get a copy of that. And by the way, the recording of the webinar is going to be put on YouTube, so anybody who wants to look at the webinar or came in between can always look at the recording on YouTube, right? Will the final score depend on the level of the last? No, the final score will depend upon how you've performed on the entire 31 questions, right? If you get the last question wrong, does not mean your question set will drop. But ideally, if you go to the last question, your last question, if it's something like the 730 or the 740 level, you get it right, you'll get a 740 or 750. You get it wrong, you'll get a 730. That's all, right? So it depends upon the accuracy of your entire 31 questions and 36 questions. What is the correlation bet 251 with GMAT score? I'm new to the GMAT. Please explain. I didn't understand your question, Sudhanshu. What is correlation bet 251? So can you be a little more clear about the question you're asking? So will you be sending? Yes. So the error log will be sent to you post the session part. So tomorrow the marketing team will send out a copy to you. All right. Classroom or online coaching of Crack Verbal, which one do you recommend? Sagar, you're asking me a wrong question, right? It's I would completely be biased, and I would say that both are equally good. But look at I'll be as again blunt and frank as I can, right? What is the advantage of a classroom session? The advantage of a classroom session is you have FaceTime with the faculty. But what is the advantage of an online session? The advantage of an online session is you can have a look at the lecture again and again and again. So you can actually tailor the entire course to match with your learning curve. But in a classroom session, it's going to be a 3-hour session, and that 3-hour session you will not be able to repeat. You can repeat it, but it's another batch. But at that point, you will not be able to, right? So that's the advantage between the two. Otherwise, the content-wise, everything is exactly the same. Kaushal, like I said, the way you approach DS questions has to be slightly different. So the first thing I would do is sit down and understand the two data sufficiency question types very well. And then I would look at what are the strategies that I can use to plug in values on a data sufficiency question or to break down the question stem, right? And then I would take those strategies, like make it like my working procedures and create like a structure of what I'm going to do on a DS question. And then I would take questions and solve them one by one by one. See, Kumar, if your diagnostic score is very low, right, you don't need to get bogged down by it. You need to understand that the diagnostic score gives you a ground zero to start with, right? So it's better for you now to think, okay, if your diagnosis scores low, I think your quant is not up to the mark. So you'll have to spend more time on getting the foundations of quant and verbal in place. So that might take you an extra 1 month than a normal student, right? So if a average student takes around 3 months, then in your case it would take maybe a month extra. But you will have to tailor your learning process to match with, you know, your learning curve. Okay, so keep that in mind. Don't expect for everybody a 3-month time frame to hold good. Is there a format for the error log, Nitin? The Excel sheet that I send you, no, will have the 2020 tracker sheet, so that will have the error log in it. Okay, so don't worry. It's an error log that I'm sending you for the 2020 OG. Any different impact over score on skipping an easy or hard question? Definitely. If you skip an easy question, I told you, no, you're going to be penalized for getting easier questions wrong. You're not going to be penalized for getting the harder questions wrong. Okay. So easier questions, ideally you shouldn't skip, right? So that's why we always say skip in the middle of the test, right? Because if you've done well in your first 8 to 10 questions, no, ideally your levels will be slightly higher. So there you can afford a couple of guesses because you're sure that the guesses would be on harder levels of question that won't impact your score too much. When someone scores 48 on quant and verbal 40, how it makes to GMAT score, relation between quant and verbal score, the GMAT. Sudhanshu, that I'm not getting into at this point, okay, because you know, it would take me like half an hour to explain, or 15 minutes to explain to you how the scoring is done and how the splits are done. So my advice is to look up, you know, the video course that we have, or if you're attending the classroom session, this will be done in the first session of quant. Okay, it's not too late to apply this year, Manish. Applications only start in September. Yeah, Srivatsa, if your quant is already taken at a 49, no, then you don't need to worry. So you can spend the big part of the 1.5 months to improve on your verbal score, right? Is it possible? Yeah, I think it's fine, Srivatsa. Even if you're working, no, I think 1.5 to 2 months will suffice because you have to focus more on verbal here, right? Yeah, my full name. That's a really weird question. My name is Aditya Kumar. Okay, so my full name is Aditya Kumar. So uh, I head the quant division here at Crack Verbal. Okay. Nidhi, if you're at a quant 47, right, you'll have to look at what problem areas you have. Normally 47, no, from my experience, I know for a fact that you might struggle slightly on data sufficiency. I know that inequalities, absolute values will create a problem. Sometimes coordinate geometry will, right? So there will be very specific topics that you'll have to focus on. So my advice, don't spend your time. Maybe you will be more comfortable with ratios, percentages, word problems, right? Rates. Um, don't focus your attention on those topics because you know that if you get a question, you'll work with it. Focus on your attention on the topics that you're weak at, right? If you do that, no, things will take care of themselves. Okay, guys. So fine. So I think that's the last question. I hope I've answered all of your questions, right? So anyway, so we've already gone way beyond the time that is scheduled. So I'll see you then. I will always take a webinar maybe once a month. So there will always be 2 webinars on quant. So I'll hope to see you maybe a month down the line when I take a webinar again, or I hope to see you in maybe the classroom sessions, or maybe people from Delhi. I will see you this weekend. All right. All right. Thank you. See you. Good night. Take care.